The celebration was hidden behind velvet curtains and guarded doors, far from the noise of ordinary Madrid nights. From the street, the building looked like a restored private club, elegant and discreet, but inside it breathed a different kind of air. Power lived there. It moved slowly, confidently, without needing to announce itself. The exclusive syndicate celebration occupied the deepest room, a space designed to feel untouchable. Low lights reflected off dark wood and polished glass. Soft music played, but no one truly listened to it. Conversations were murmurs, carefully measured, never rising too high. In that room, even laughter was controlled. Men in tailored suits stood or sat in small groups, their posture relaxed but alert, like predators at rest. These were not men who needed to raise their voices. Their authority had already been established elsewhere in places no one here spoke about. The doors were guarded by silent figures who did not drink, did not smile, and did not look away. Anyone who entered knew immediately where they stood in the hierarchy. You could feel it in your chest like pressure. At the center of it all sat the Mafia boss. He did not command attention by speaking. He commanded it by existing. When he entered the room earlier, conversations had not stopped abruptly. They had simply faded like sound pulled into a vacuum. Now he sat in a leather chair, slightly apart from the others, his posture straight, his movements minimal. His suit was dark, perfectly fitted, free of unnecessary detail. He did not wear jewelry beyond a watch that looked old and worn, as if it had survived a lifetime of things no one else could see. His face was calm, almost unreadable. Cold, some would say, disciplined certainly. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, people leaned in. His authority was not loud or aggressive. It was silent and absolute. No one interrupted him. No one questioned him. Fear lived comfortably around him, not as panic, but as respect sharpened by consequence. Across the room, moving carefully between tables, was the waitress. Valeria carried a tray balanced with instinctive precision, her steps measured, her shoulders slightly tense. She had learned long ago how to move without drawing attention, how to exist in spaces that did not want to notice her. Her uniform was clean but simple, designed to erase individuality. Her hair was tied back tightly, not for style but for practicality. Every movement she made was efficient, practiced after years of double shifts and long nights. She was exhausted. It lived in the small ache in her lower back, in the heaviness behind her eyes, in the way her feet burned with every step. She had been awake since before dawn, leaving her mother coughing softly in their small apartment. The worry followed her like a shadow. Bills unpaid, tests postponed, time slipping away. Tonight was just another shift, another night of serving people who lived in a different universe. She was not there to be seen. She was there to survive. As she moved through the room, she felt the subtle danger in the air, not obvious threats, but the kind that settled under the skin. She noticed how some men spoke too loudly, compensating for their position. Others spoke barely at all because they did not need to. She noticed how glances shifted toward the center of the room, how bodies adjusted unconsciously when the boss moved his hand or leaned forward. Once, as she passed near his table, she felt it clearly. The whispers stopped, not because he spoke, but because he adjusted in his seat. The silence lasted only a second, but it was enough to make her heart stutter. She lowered her gaze automatically, placing a glass down with careful hands, then stepping back. For a brief moment, she looked at him. He was older than she had expected, lines etched into his face that spoke of years lived under pressure. His eyes were sharp, observant, but distant, as if always focused on something far beyond the room, and in that instant something unexpected stirred inside her. He looked alone, not lonely in the way of someone who lacked company, but isolated in a way that power often creates. Surrounded by men, guarded by loyalty and fear, yet separated from everyone by an invisible wall. She had never imagined feeling anything toward someone like him. Their lives were not meant to touch. A mafia boss and a waitress existed on opposite ends of the world. One ruled, the other endured. One decided, the other adapted. And yet, as she turned away and continued her work, a quiet awareness lingered. The room where power breathed had noticed nothing, but something fragile had already been planted. The room shifted its weight slowly as the night deepened, and the drinks flowed with quiet excess. And Valeria felt it before she heard it, the change in the air, when one of the men near the boss leaned back in his chair and laughed too loudly, a laugh that scraped against the low, controlled atmosphere like a blade against stone. He was a Capwargime, one of the men who enjoyed reminding others that power could be cruel when it wished to be. His voice carried easily, cutting through the music and the murmurs as he snapped his fingers. Without even looking in her direction, Valeria stopped beside the table, instantly her body responding before her thoughts. Did she had learned that hesitation was punished in places like this? He did not look at her when he spoke, only at the glass in his hand, as if she were furniture, as if she existed only to correct his inconvenience. He complained about the drink, the temperature, the glass, the speed of service, each word carefully chosen to humiliate rather than correct the men around him, smiled thinly, some amused, others relieved it was not their turn to be the target. Valeria listened, without reacting, her face calm, her posture respectful, her hands steady despite the tension crawling up her spine. She apologized softly and reached for the glass, knowing better than to argue, knowing that dignity in this room was something you protected silently or lost forever. As she turned to leave, she heard him again, his voice dripping with mockery, asking her if she understood how much money was sitting at that table, how a single watch on a wrist could erase her entire life, how some people were born to serve, and others to command. Laughter followed, sharper this time, testing the boundaries of what was allowed. Valeria felt the words land like blows, but she did not flinch. She had learned long ago that responding only fed men like this. She focused on her breathing, on the weight of the on the familiar ache in her shoulders. She thought of her mother alone in their apartment, the cough that never fully went away, the medicine they rationed to make it last longer. She had survived worse than words. She would survive this too. Across the room, the Mafia boss watched without moving. He did not intervene. He did not raise his hand or silence the man. The lack of reaction was not approval, but it felt heavier than any shout. The Capwargime eventually grew bored of his own cruelty and waved her away, dismissing her with a flick of his fingers as if she were nothing. Valeria walked back toward the bar, her steps measured, her face composed. But inside, something burned, not anger, but a quiet resolve, the kind that had kept her standing for years. She poured another drink with careful precision, wiping the rim twice to steady her hands. She refused to let them see her shake. When she returned to the room, she felt it again, the way the atmosphere shifted subtly. When the boss adjusted his posture, conversation's softened eyes flickered toward him and away again. He had not said a word, yet the room obeyed him all the same. Valeria passed near his table, and for a brief moment their gazes almost met. She caught the smallest change in his expression, not sympathy, not pity, but attention, as if he had noticed something he had not intended to see. The men laughed again, but quieter now, more restrained. The danger in the room had sharpened, invisible but undeniable. Valeria lowered her eyes and continued working, unaware that something fragile had cracked beneath the surface of power, and that the man who ruled the room had seen her endurance and would not forget it. The night continued to stretch forward, heavy and slow, as if time itself was cautious inside that room, and Valeria felt her body moving on memory alone, her hands lifting glasses, placing bottles, clearing plates without thought, until exhaustion blurred the edges of everything. The laughter had dulled, the music felt distant, and the air was thick with perfume, smoke, and unspoken threat. She approached the central table again to remove empty glasses, and as she leaned forward, the man at the center of the room shifted, slightly rolling up the sleeve of his shirt just enough to free his wrist from the tight cuff. It was a small, careless movement, something no one else noticed or cared about, but for Valeria it was as if the room vanished entirely. Her breath caught painfully in her chest, the tray in her hands grew suddenly heavier, and her vision narrowed until all she could see was the skin of his wrist, and the mark etched into it, a rose, dark and precise, its lines softened by time, and beneath it a date carved in numbers she had memorized before she had learned to read for a heartbeat. She thought she was imagining it, that exhaustion had finally broken her mind, but the longer she stared, the clearer it became. Every curve, every detail was identical. The rose was not generic, it was specific, the petals angled just so the stem curved in a way she had traced with her finger 1,000 times on her mother's skin. When she was a child, the date beneath it burned into her memory, a date her mother never celebrated but never forgot. Her heart began to pound so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. The room felt too warm, too small, too unreal. She remembered her mother sitting on the edge of the bed late at night when the pain was bad, her voice low and distant as she spoke about a past. She rarely touched a boy she once loved in Florence, a promise made too young, a mistake that cost her everything. Her mother had never spoken his name, never described his face, only the tattoo she had once shared with him, and the way she said it marked the worst choice of her life. Valeria had grown up believing that man belonged to a world that no longer existed, that he had vanished like a ghost long before she was born. And now he was sitting in front of her, alive, powerful, untouchable. Her fingers trembled and she nearly dropped the glass she was holding. She forced herself to steady her hands, to breathe slowly, to remember where she was and who she was in that moment, a waitress in a room ruled by men who erased people without consequence. She told herself it was coincidence that tattoos were common, that dates repeated, that memory could lie. She tried to step back, to disappear as she always did, but her feet refused to move. The question rose inside her, sharp and unstoppable. What if this was not coincidence? What if the man her mother had buried in silence was sitting 10 steps away? She cleared her throat softly and took a cautious step forward. Her voice felt thin when she spoke, almost swallowed by the room. Sir. She said the word barely audible, yet it carried farther than she expected. The conversation near the table slowed, and the Caporgime frowned, annoyed at the interruption. The boss did not look up, yet Valeria swallowed and forced the words out before fear could stop her. My mother has the same tattoo, the same rose, the same date. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The glass in the boss's hand slipped and shattered against the floor, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Every voice in the room died instantly. Chairs stopped shifting, hands froze mid-motion. The boss lifted his head slowly, and when his eyes met hers, something changed. Not anger, not confusion, but shock, raw and unguarded, as if a door he had sealed decades ago had been torn open. Without warning, power drained from his posture, leaving behind something human and exposed. The room held its breath, and Valeria realized too late that whatever line separated their worlds had just been crossed, and there was no way back. The silence after the glass shattered did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like the air itself had turned solid and pressed against every chest in the room. Valeria stood frozen, her heart racing so violently she feared it might betray her. The men around the table did not move, not because they were afraid of her, but because they were afraid of what they were witnessing. The Mafia boss remained standing now, his chair pushed slightly back, his eyes locked on her face as if he were searching for something he had lost long ago. His expression was no longer cold or disciplined, it was fractured, stripped of control, in a way no one in that room had ever seen before. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step toward her, and the room reacted instantly. Guards straightened, hands hovered near hidden weapons, whispers died before they could form. Valeria felt the weight of every gaze on her, but she could not look away from him. There was something in his eyes now, not rage, not suspicion, but recognition mixed with dread, as if the past had risen from the floor where he had buried it and wrapped its hands around his throat. Say that again, he said quietly, his voice low and steady yet trembling beneath the surface. Valeria swallowed, her mouth dry, her legs weak. She should have stepped back, should have apologized, should have disappeared, but the truth had already escaped, and it refused to be taken back. My mother, she said softly, forcing the words out. My mother has the same tattoo, the rose, the date. A murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced by a single raised hand from the boss. The Caporgime who had mocked her earlier shifted uncomfortably, his confidence cracking, as he sensed something dangerous unfolding that he did not understand. The boss turned his wrist, slowly examining the tattoo, as if seeing it for the first time in decades. His fingers brushed the ink unconsciously, a gesture so personal it felt invasive to witness. Florence, he said suddenly, his voice barely above a breath. Valeria felt the name strike her like a blow. She nodded once, unable to speak, her throat burned. Her mother had spoken that city like a wound that never closed. The boss took another step closer, stopping just far enough not to touch her. The distance felt deliberate, respectful, and unbearable all at once. What is your mother's name? He asked. The question landed heavier than any threat. Valeria hesitated, fear and instinct battling inside her. She knew that name carried weight, power, consequences. but something deeper than fear pushed her forward. Marina Roman, she said. The reaction was immediate. His face drained of color, and for a moment he looked older than his years, as if time had finally caught up to him. The room vanished for him, replaced by memories. He had spent a lifetime outrunning a young woman with tired eyes, and a stubborn smile, promises whispered in a language of dreams, fear disguised as duty, a lie dressed as mercy. He staggered back a fraction, bracing himself against the table. The men around him exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen this man order deaths without blinking, but they had never seen him shaken by a name. 25 years, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Valeria felt her breath hitch. She did not yet understand the full meaning of what he was saying, but she knew instinctively that her life had just split into before and after. The boss lifted his gaze to her again, and his voice broke through the silence with a truth that made the room feel suddenly too small. I was told the child did not live. The words struck her like ice. I am here, Valeria said, her voice trembling but clear. I am 25 years old. No one moved, no one spoke. The Mafia boss closed his eyes slowly, as if the weight of that sentence had crushed something inside him. When he opened them again, they were wet and burning with something far more dangerous than anger, regret. The room where power breathed had become a room where the past had finally found its voice, and nothing would ever be the same again. The room did not return to normal after the truth was spoken. It remained suspended, as if time itself had been wounded. The Mafia boss stood very still, his face rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed carved from stone, yet inside him something violent was unfolding. Valeria could feel it without seeing it, a storm turning inward. Memories he had buried beneath years of blood deals, loyalty tests, and disciplined silence were tearing through him with merciless clarity. Florence returned to him not as a city, but as a season of his life when he had still believed love could exist without cost, when he had still thought choice belonged to him. He saw Marina as she had been, young, defiant, tired, but radiant in a way that had frightened him. Because she had seen the man beneath the future boss, she had wanted a life together, not power, not protection, just truth, and he had failed her. He remembered the night everything broke, his father sitting across from him in a dark office, the walls heavy with inherited authority, the words spoken without anger, only certainty. This child will destroy everything you are meant to become. The family will not survive scandal. The solution had been delivered cold and final. A doctor paid a report, altered, a lie wrapped in mercy. He had been told the pregnancy ended. He had believed it because belief was easier than defiance. He had let Marina disappear because syndicate demanded obedience, and fear had won over love. The tattoo on his wrist had been carved after that night, not as a symbol of devotion, but as punishment, something he could never erase. Valeria watched his face change as the weight of those years crushed him. She saw the power drain from his posture, the myth of the untouchable man unraveling thread by thread. The men around them sensed danger, not from violence, but from exposure. They did not understand what was happening, but they understood one thing clearly. This was not a moment to interrupt. The Capwargime, who had mocked her earlier, shifted back, his confidence gone, replaced by unease. He realized too late that this waitress had stepped into a place no one else was allowed to stand. The boss finally spoke again, his voice low, rough, stripped of command. I searched for her, he said quietly. I searched for months, then years, but she was gone. No address, no trace, nothing. He turned his eyes back to Valeria, and for the first time there was no calculation in his gaze, only pain. I was told the child was buried before it ever learned to breathe. He drew a sharp breath, as if the air itself hurt. And all this time you lived without me. Valeria felt anger rise, sharp and unfamiliar. She had not planned to feel it, but it demanded space. You lived with everything, she said quietly. I lived with nothing. My mother worked until her hands cracked. She coughed through nights alone. She never spoke your name because she thought you chose to erase us. Her words were not loud, but they cut deeper than any accusation. The boss closed his eyes again, his shoulders lowering, not in defeat, but in acceptance. I did erase you, he said, and there was no excuse in his voice, only truth. I let power decide for me, and power always takes more than it gives. In that moment the room changed forever. The men who ruled streets and lives understood that something irreversible had occurred. The boss, who had never been challenged, had been confronted by blood, by consequence, by a life that had survived his silence, and Valeria understood that the man before her was no longer only a mafia boss, he was a father who had lost 25 years. And the past was no longer buried, it was standing between them, breathing, waiting to be answered. The decision was made without ceremony and without permission, and that was what frightened everyone the most. The mafia boss did not raise his voice. He did not issue an order to the room, he simply reached for his coat and stood. And the men around him reacted too late, realizing that this was not a performance, but a choice, a dangerous one. Valeria felt the shift immediately, the guard's stiffened instincts screaming that the boss never moved without layers of protection, that the streets outside did not belong to this room of velvet and silence. Yet he looked at her not as an employer, not as a ruler, but as a man who had just discovered his blood still lived. And that knowledge had cracked something open inside him. "Take me to her," he said quietly. And the words carried no command, only urgency. Valeria hesitated, fear coiling in her chest, because she understood the danger better than anyone. He did not belong in her neighborhood, not without consequences, not without shadows following him, but the truth had already pulled them past the point of safety, and something told her that refusing would only deepen the wound. She nodded once, and that single movement sealed what could no longer be undone. They left through a side exit, the night air cold and sharp against Valeria's skin, as if the world itself was warning them. The car waiting was black, unmarked and silent. The driver did not ask questions, he did not need to. The city unfolded around them as they moved away from the polished avenues into narrower streets where the lights dimmed, and the buildings leaned closer together. Valeria sat in the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her thoughts racing. She had lived here all her life, but never like this, never beside a man whose presence could bend the city itself. The boss stared out the window, his jaw tight, his leg moving restlessly, the discipline he wore like armor beginning to slip. He did not speak, and neither did she. The silence was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with things neither knew how to say. As they crossed into her district, the contrast became brutal. The streets were worn, the walls stained by years of neglect, the air carrying the smell of old stone and damp concrete. This was not a place men like him entered without intent, and Valeria felt a flash of shame. She hated herself, for she did not want him to see this part of her life. The narrow stairwells, the flickering lights, the neighbors who knew her by exhaustion more than by name. The car stopped, and the boss stepped out first, his shoes touching cracked pavement without hesitation. He looked around, taking in the surroundings with a strange calm, as if acknowledging a world he had helped create from a distance. He dismissed the driver with a subtle gesture, choosing to walk the rest of the way alone. And that was when Valeria understood the depth of his choice. This was not about power anymore, it was about exposure. They climbed the stairs in silence, each step echoing in the narrow space. Valeria's heart pounded with every floor they passed. When she reached the door, her hands shook, and she paused, breath caught in her throat. This was the threshold between past and present, between survival and truth. She warned him softly that her mother was weak, that she was sick, that seeing him could break something fragile. He nodded, accepting whatever consequence waited on the other side. When the door opened, the small apartment felt suddenly too quiet. Too small to hold the weight of what followed. The room smelled of medicine and old books, and the soft sound of breathing came from the chair near the window. Her mother looked up, and in that instant the years collapsed. Her face drained of color, her body stiffened, and the man who had ruled cities stood helpless before the woman he had abandoned. The line of blood had been crossed, and there was no retreat, only reckoning. Marina did not scream when she saw him, and that silence was more devastating than any outburst could have been. Her body went rigid in the chair, fingers gripping the worn fabric of the armrest, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes locked onto his face, and in them lived 25 years of restraint, pain, and survival. Valeria felt her chest tighten, watching her mother shrink inward, not from fear, but from memories that had never healed. The mafia boss stood just inside the doorway, unmoving, stripped of every layer of authority he had worn for decades. He did not take another step forward, because he understood instantly that this space did not belong to him and might never again. "You should not be here," Marina said finally, her voice hoarse but steady, and the words carried more weight than any threat ever could. Valeria had never heard that tone before, not anger, not hysteria, but exhaustion so deep it bordered on grief. The The boss opened his mouth, then closed it again as if realizing no defense would survive this moment. He lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of guilt. I know, he said quietly, and that was all. He did not explain, he did not justify, he did not ask forgiveness. He stood there and let the silence accuse him. Marina laughed once, a short bitter sound that made Valeria flinch. You know, she repeated, and her eyes burned with unshed tears. You knew, when you chose to disappear, when you chose power over truth, when you let them erase us as if we never existed. The words poured out now, years of restraint cracking open. I waited for you, I looked for you, I carried your child while being told you were gone by choice, that you did not want us, that you had solved the problem. She leaned forward, breath shaking. I was alone, and I survived. Without you. Valeria felt tears rise, but she stayed silent, knowing this was not her space to interrupt. The boss listened, without looking away, each word landing like a blow. He nodded once slowly. I failed you, he said, and his voice broke just enough to reveal the man beneath the legend. I believed a lie, because it was easier than fighting the truth. I let fear guide me, and it destroyed everything that mattered. His hands clenched at his sides, and Valeria saw the effort it took for him not to reach out. Marina closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were glassy but focused. You do not get to return now and pretend regret fixes time, she said. You do not get to step into my home and claim what you abandoned. Her voice softened only when she glanced at Valeria. You were never meant to know him. I protected you by carrying this alone. I am not here to claim anything, the boss said, quickly stepping back a fraction. I am here because I learned she lived, and I could not stay away another day. He looked at Valeria, then back to Marina. I will not ask for forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I only want to help because you are ill, and because I owe you both more than I can ever repay. The word ill changed everything. Marina's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining out of her. She was tired, too tired to carry rage any longer. Valeria moved to her side, kneeling, and taking her mother's hand. Mom, please, she whispered. We need help. The room held its breath. Marina looked between them and finally nodded once, not in surrender, but in survival. If you help, she said, it will be on my terms. You will not control, you will not command, you will not erase us again. The boss bowed his head. Yes, he said simply, and in that moment the reckoning was complete. The past had spoken, the truth had been heard, and the road ahead would not be ruled by power but by choice. The hospital corridors were quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if the building itself knew the weight of the people moving through it. Valeria walked beside her mother, holding her arm, feeling how light she had become, how every step cost effort. The Mafia boss followed a pace behind, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to disappear. And for the first time, Valeria noticed how careful he was making himself smaller in a place where his name usually opened every door. Doctors did not rush because of fear. Nurses did not whisper his identity. No favors were demanded. No threats were implied. He spoke only when asked, and when he did, his voice was calm, stripped of authority, reduced to concern. Tests were ordered immediately, blood drawn, scans taken, machines humming softly as Marina lay still staring at the ceiling. Valeria watched every movement, her heart hammering with fear she had carried alone for years. This was the moment she had dreaded and prayed for all at once. The possibility of answers terrified her, because answers meant reality, and reality could still take everything away. The Mafia boss sat across the room, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on Marina, as if he were afraid to look away in case she vanished like she had before. Hours passed in a blur of white walls and muted footsteps, and waiting stretched thin until it hurt. When the doctor finally returned, Valeria felt her breath leave her body before a word was spoken. Marina gripped her hand tightly, her fingers cold and trembling. The doctor spoke slowly, carefully explaining that the illness was serious but not a death sentence, that months of neglect and stress had taken their toll, but treatment could restore what exhaustion had stolen. Relief hit Valeria so hard her knees nearly gave out. She covered her mouth to keep from crying, and Marina closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The Mafia boss did not move for a long moment, then he lowered his head, as if something heavy had finally been lifted from his chest. From that moment everything changed, but not in the way Valeria expected. There were no dramatic gestures, no public displays of power, no bribes, no intimidation, no erasing of rules. The boss arranged care quietly, respectfully, hiring specialists, ensuring medication and rest without ever forcing his presence. Marina noticed this, and though she said little, her body relaxed slowly day by day, as as the fear receded. Valeria watched her mother sleep more peacefully than she had in years and felt something fragile bloom inside her hope. One evening, as Marina rested, the boss sat across from Valeria at the small kitchen table. The room was dim lit by a single lamp casting soft shadows on walls that had seen too much. He slid a folder toward her, but did not push it closer. Inside were documents for education, housing, medical care resources. He had arranged without obligation, without condition. Valeria looked at him unsure, and he spoke before she could question. "I am not trying to buy forgiveness," he said quietly. "I am trying to return what should never have been taken choice." The word struck her deeply. She had lived her life without it, shaped by survival, limited by circumstance, and here it was being offered, not demanded, not tied to obedience. Valeria felt tears sting her eyes, and she looked away, struggling with emotions too large to name. The boss watched her carefully, ready to accept rejection. If it came, blood did not entitle him to anything. He understood that now. In that small kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a life built from endurance, redemption did not arrive with grandeur. It arrived softly, in restraint, in presence, in the decision to protect without possession. And Valeria realized that power used gently was the most dangerous transformation of all. The offer did not come wrapped in promises or raised voices, and that was what made it dangerous. Valeria felt it pressing against her long after the folder had been closed and set aside on the table. It was not the money itself that unsettled her. It was the meaning behind it, the quiet assumption that her life could now move in directions she had never allowed herself to imagine. She had learned to live within limits so tight they felt like laws. And suddenly those limits were being loosened by the very man who had once erased her existence. The contradiction made her chest ache. She waited until her mother was asleep before speaking. The apartment was dim, the city murmuring outside the window, and the Mafia boss sat across from her, hands folded, posture controlled yet uncertain, in a way she had never seen before. Valeria finally lifted her eyes and met his gaze. "I need to understand something," she said slowly. "If I accept your help, what do you expect from me?" Her voice did not shake, but her heart did. He did not answer immediately, and the pause stretched long enough for her to wonder if this was where the truth would finally fracture. "I expect nothing," he said at last, and there was no hesitation in his tone, no loyalty, no gratitude, no name. "I do not deserve. If you take this, it is because it is yours, not because you owe me anything." The words settled between them, heavy and unfamiliar. Valeria searched his face for manipulation, for calculation, for the shadow of control she had seen in men like him all her life, but found none, only resolve mixed with something close to fear. She swallowed hard. "Do you expect me to forgive you?" she asked, and the question cut deeper than she intended. It was the one that had haunted her since the night the glass shattered. He exhaled slowly and shook his head. "I am not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I know some things cannot be repaired. I am only asking for the chance to remain present. If you decide one day that you want nothing to do with me, I will accept it, and if you never call me anything more than my name, I will still be here." The honesty of it struck her like a blow. She had prepared herself to fight manipulation, not humility. She thought of her mother sleeping in the next room, fragile, but alive because of his restraint rather than his power. She thought of her own dreams buried beneath years of exhaustion and fear. And she realized that this choice was not about him, it was about her. "I am angry," she said quietly, and the admission felt necessary, cleansing. "I am angry for what my mother lost, for what I lost, for the years that never come back." He nodded once, accepting it without defense. "You have every right to be. But I am also tired," Valeria continued, "tired of surviving, tired of pretending. I do not want more," and the words frightened her, because speaking them made them real. The Mafia boss watched her carefully, not interrupting, not guiding, letting the moment belong to her alone. She drew a slow breath. "If I take this help, it will be on my terms," she said. "I decide what my future looks like. I decide when and how we speak. I decide who you are in my life. And if at any moment I need distance, you will respect it." His answer came immediately, yes. In that moment, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. The power dynamic that had once defined everything dissolved into something fragile and uncertain. And honest, Valeria felt the weight of choice settle onto her shoulders, and instead of crushing her, it steadied her. Later, when she told her mother, Marina listened without interruption, her face unreadable, until Valeria finished speaking. Then she reached for her daughter's hand. "You do not owe him your heart," she said softly, "only your truth. If you choose to take what he offers, do it for yourself, not for him." Valeria nodded, feeling tears rise not from pain but from clarity. For the first time, her life was not being shaped by fear or obligation, but by intention, and somewhere in that fragile space between past and future, she allowed herself to imagine a path forward, one she chose herself. The morning arrived quietly, as if it understood that endings did not need noise. Valeria stood by the window watching pale light spill across the buildings of her neighborhood, the same streets that had shaped her endurance, now preparing to release her into something unknown. Her suitcase rested near the door, not heavy with possessions, but with intention. Inside were clothes chosen with care, books her mother had once loved, and documents that carried her name toward a future she had not allowed herself to want until now. The apartment felt different, lighter, as if the walls themselves knew that survival was no longer the only story being told. Marina sat in her chair, wrapped in a soft blanket, her color stronger, her breathing steadier than it had been in years. She watched her daughter with eyes full of pride and fear, woven together. Valeria knelt beside her, resting her head against her mother's knee for a moment, neither speaking, because some truths were too complete for words. "You are not leaving me," she said gently. "You are choosing yourself," Marina answered, and her voice did not shake this time. "That is not abandonment, that is courage." A quiet knock came at the door, and Valeria knew before opening it who stood outside. The Mafia boss waited in the hallway, not crossing the threshold, until she invited him, and he looked different now, not smaller, but grounded. His suit was simple, his posture relaxed, and his eyes held something unfamiliar, peace earned through surrender rather than control. He glanced at the suitcase, then back at Valeria, understanding without needing explanation. "I will drive you," he said, and it was not an order, it was an offer. The journey to the airport passed in silence filled with meaning. Marina sat in the back seat, watching the city slide past, as if committing it to memory. Valeria sat beside her, holding her hand, while the man at the wheel drove carefully, respecting every signal, every pause. When they arrived, the world widened into motion, rolling bags, voices in many languages, announcements echoing softly. Valeria felt the weight of the moment press against her chest and welcomed it. At the entrance they stopped. This was the line that could not be crossed. Together, Marina pulled Valeria into an embrace, holding her longer than necessary, breathing her in, as if she could store the moment inside herself. "You were never meant to stay small," she whispered. "Go live." Valeria felt tears fall, but did not fight them. She turned then to the man who had altered everything. With a tattoo and a truth, they stood facing each other, uncertain, but present. "I do not know what to call you," she said honestly, and he nodded. "I am not asking you to name me," he replied, "just let me stay where you allow." She considered him for a long moment, then spoke words that would shape them both. "I do not know if I will ever call you father, but I will let you be here." And the simplicity of that sentence broke him more completely than rage ever could. He bowed his head, accepting the gift for what it was, a beginning, not a title. As Valeria walked toward security, she turned once more. Marina lifted her hand, smiling through tears. The man stood still, watching her with eyes that held no claim, only gratitude. She raised her hand in return and crossed forward into her life. Weeks later, Florence welcomed her with stone streets and open skies. The university corridors buzzed with possibility, and Valeria moved through them with cautious wonder. She wrote letters to her mother filled with small details about lectures and cafes and long walks through history. She wrote fewer words to him, but each one mattered. He answered every time, without demand, without pressure, simply present. One evening she stood on a bridge, watching the river move beneath her, carrying stories forward, and she understood the final truth. The shocking revelation was not that a mafia boss had a daughter, or that blood had survived silence. It was that power could choose restraint, that love could exist without ownership, and that a life once shaped by fear could be rebuilt through choice. Valeria breathed deeply, feeling peace settle where survival once lived, and far away, a man who had ruled through silence learned at last how to remain through humility.